The sea is a vast, unyielding archive of grief and glory, a mirror that reflects the souls of those brave enough to challenge its depths. But there are tides that never turned, winds that died in the throat of the sky, and fates that were rewritten in the ink of shadows. We know the boy who wore the straw hat, the one whose laughter sounded like liberation and whose spirit was as boundless as the horizon. We remember the sun-drenched docks of Fuchsia Village and the promise made under a red-haired man's gaze. But fate is a fickle weaver. What if the sun never rose over the east blue? What if the boy of destiny was swallowed not by the sea but by the sugary, suffocating embrace of a queen who hungers for more than just candy? Imagine a world where the will of D was tempered in the ovens of Totto Land, where a rubber heart was taught that family is not a bond of choice, but a contract of blood and soul. This is the chronicle of a king born of sweetness and cruelty, a legend of a boy who was promised the world only to find it served on a silver platter of madness. Before we set sail across this altered sea of fate, join our voyage, so these stories of what might have been are never lost to time. The sea does not forgive, but it possesses a long and haunting memory. In the world we know, the currents carried a young boy toward a horizon of golden dreams, fueled by the scent of salt and the promise of a straw hat. But fate, like a shifting tide, has a way of turning toward the dark. Our story begins not with a promise on a sun-drenched pier, but with a betrayal of the wind. A marine vessel, unflagged and riding low in the water, cut through the fog of the New World. On board, Vice Admiral Garp, the hero of the Marines, carried a secret more volatile than any ancient weapon, a grandson with the D in his name and the fire of the sun in his eyes. Garp had hoped to hide the boy in the furthest reaches of the blue, far from the reach of the throne, but he had underestimated the gluttony of the great souls. The ambush was not heralded by cannons, but by a song, a high, screeching melody that seemed to bleed from the very waves. The Queen Mama Chanter, a ship of living wood and sentient sails, emerged from the mist like a colorful nightmare. Big Mom did not want gold. She wanted additions to her collection. She wanted the blood of the hero to season her table. In the chaos of the boarding, amidst the clash of hockey that split the sky into bruised shades of violet and gold, the boy was lost. A stray reach of Perospero's candy, a swirl of cream, and the small laughing child was snatched from the deck. Garp's roar of agony was swallowed by the sea, a sound that would haunt the depths for decades as the Charlotte family retreated into the sugary vale of Totto Land. When the boy first stepped onto the shores of Whole Cake Island, he did not cry. He was a creature of pure instinct, and the world he found was a sensory fever dream. The ground beneath his tiny sandals was made of biscuit. The rivers ran with thick, cooling chocolate, and the flowers sang in voices that sounded like fading memories. It was a paradise designed by a madwoman, a utopia built on the stolen lifespans of the fearful. Charlotte Linlin looked down at the toddler, her shadow stretching across the cake-shaped hills like a coming eclipse. She did not see a grandson of a rival. She saw a rare ingredient. She saw a boy who carried the cursed lineage of the will of D, a spark that she intended to smother in syrup until it became a loyal flame. "Luffy," she whispered, her voice a tectonic rumble that shook the frosting from the trees. "You will be my masterpiece. You will be the sweetness that never ends." In this distorted cradle, the boy's education began. There was no Makino to offer a gentle smile, no mayor to grumble about duty. Instead, there were the sweet commanders, warriors of iron and icing. Katakuri, the man with the stitched mouth and the burden of perfection, looked upon the boy with a cold, prophetic pity. He saw the potential for a monster. It was here, in the heart of the queen's pantry, that the Gomu Gomu no Mi was presented to him. It was not a fruit of chance found in a pirate's chest, but a ritualistic offering. Big Mom watched with hungry eyes as the boy ate the purple fruit. Not because he was hungry for adventure, but because he was told that in Totto Land, one must consume or be consumed. The rubber power did not bring him joy. In the beginning, it was a source of torment. The Charlotte siblings laughed as they stretched his limbs to the breaking point, testing the elasticity of his soul. He was a toy, a curiosity, a prince of putty. But as the years bled into one another, the cloying sweetness of the islands began to seep into his spirit. The boy who once would have dreamed of the open sky now looked at the horizon and saw only a boundary to be expanded for Mama's table. He learned to use his rubber body not to bounce with laughter, but to snap back with the violence of a coiled serpent. He grew taller in the shadow of the chateau, his skin perpetually smelling of burnt sugar and ozone. He became a favorite of Linlin, a pet who sat at the foot of her throne during the bloodiest tea parties. He watched as his mother tore the souls from the living, and he learned that love was a transaction, a debt paid in loyalty or life. The rubber boy's heart, once intended to be the drum of liberation, began to beat with a different rhythm, a heavy thudding demand for more. He became addicted to the high-stakes adrenaline of the hunt and the sugary rewards of the feast. By the age of 10, the boy known as Charlotte Luffy was no longer a victim of the islands. He was their protector. He walked through the seducing woods and the trees bowed their heads in genuine terror. He did not seek a crew of friends, he sought a legion of subordinates. The D in his name remained, a hidden ember beneath a mountain of candy, waiting for a spark. But for now, he was the Prince of Hunger, the elastic nightmare of the Charlotte family and the first piece of a legacy that would rewrite the map of the Grand Line in blood and frosting. The sun set over Whole Cake Island, turning the sea into a pool of strawberry jam. Luffy stood on the balcony of the chateau, his eyes reflecting the flickering lights of 1,000 homies. In his hand, he squeezed a piece of hard candy until it shattered into dust. The world was a banquet, and he was finally old enough to take his seat at the head of the table. The adolescence of Charlotte Luffy was not measured in years, but in the growing shadow he cast over the gingerbread docks of Sweet City. By his 16th year, the boy had become a masterpiece of lethal geometry. He did not wear the simple vest of a wanderer, he wore a mantle of deep plum silk, embroidered with the curling silver vines of the Charlotte crest. Around his neck hung a heavy pendant of polished amber, containing the soul of a fallen king, a gift from Mama for his first successful collection of a defiant territory. His rubber body, once a source of clumsy amusement, had hardened into something reminiscent of vulcanized iron. He moved with a terrifying liquid grace, a predator made of living gum who could stretch across a battlefield in a heartbeat to silence a scream. In the training yards of Whole Cake Island, beneath the watchful, multi-layered eyes of the chateau, Luffy sparred with his brother, Katakuri. These were not the playful brawls of siblings, but collisions of natural disasters. Katakuri, the man of Mochi, saw in Luffy a reflection of his own burden, the necessity of being an unbreakable wall for the sake of the family. "You are leaning too heavily on the snap, little brother," Katakuri would rumble, his voice muffled by the scarf that hid his own perceived imperfections. Strength in Totto Land is not just about the strike. It is about the inevitability of the return. If you stretch, you must ensure nothing is left to stand when you retract. Luffy's response was not a laugh, but a grin that reached too far across his face, a jagged crescent of white teeth. "Why bother retracting, Katakuri? I'll just wrap around the world until it stops breathing." He had mastered a technique he called the boiling point. By accelerating his blood flow through his rubber vessels, a feat he learned by watching the great ovens of the island, his skin would turn a bruised, pressurized red, emitting a steam that smelled of scorched sugar. In this state, he wasn't just fast, he was a kinetic nightmare. He didn't seek to liberate the islands he visited, he sought to incorporate them. When the big mom pirates descended upon a new shore, it was Luffy who led the vanguard. He would plummet from the sky like a fallen meteor, his Gomu Gomu no Gatling becoming a rain of obsidian-hard fists that reduced fortifications to splinters and bone to dust. To the world, he was known as the Elastic Executioner, the favorite son of the Yonko who brought a sweet, suffocating end to any dream of rebellion. Yet, deep within the marrow of his bones, the will of D stirred like a caged beast. It manifested not as a desire for the crown of the Pirate King, for in his mind the throne was already occupied by his mother, but as a bottomless, existential hunger. He ate constantly, but he was never full. He conquered, but he was never satisfied. He sat at the lavish tea parties, surrounded by the porcelain laughter of his sisters and the brooding strength of his brothers, and felt a profound, aching silence where his soul should have been. He began to have dreams, visions of a hat made of straw, of a wind that didn't smell like chocolate, and of a man whose laughter sounded like the shattering of chains. One afternoon, while overseeing the harvest of life debt on a neighboring island, Luffy encountered a young girl hiding in the ruins of a bakery. She offered him a single misshapen cracker, her hands trembling with a terror that no amount of candy could mask. In the world that should have been, Luffy would have smiled and shared a meal. Here, he looked at the offering with eyes as cold as the deep ocean. "Is this all your soul is worth today?" he asked, his voice a low, melodic threat. The girl wept, and for a fleeting, agonizing second, a phantom pain shot through Luffy's chest, a memory of a brotherhood he had never known, of a sake cup shared under a twilight sky. His hand twitched, the rubber tension in his arm coiling instinctively. He wanted to reach out, to tell her to run, to scream against the injustice of the world Mama had built. But then the shadow of a homie, a hovering, singing cloud of Zeus, drifted overhead, and the indoctrination slammed shut like a vault. "Mama requires the tribute," he whispered, more to himself than the girl. He took the cracker, crushed it into dust, and signaled for the chess soldiers to move in. As he sailed back toward the center of Totto Land, standing on the prow of his own ship, the Thirsting Soul, Luffy looked out at the horizon. The New World was a sea of storms and secrets, and he was its most loyal enforcer. But the wind was changing. A rumor was drifting through the underworld, spoken in hushed tones by those who traded in information. A red-haired Yonko was moving his fleet toward the borders of the Queen's territory. For the first time in his life, the Prince of Hunger felt a sensation that wasn't greed or duty. It was a spark of recognition. He touched the scar beneath his eye, a mark he had been told was a childhood accident in the kitchen, and felt it throb with a phantom heat. The sea was calling to the boy who had been buried in sugar, and the echoes of a forgotten promise were beginning to drown out the Queen's song. The sky over the borders of Totto Land did not turn red from the sunset. It bled because two titans were breathing the same air. The Red Force sat motionless upon the glass-calm waters of the Milk Archipelago, its wooden hull a defiant splinter in the Queen's perfect pastel mosaic. Standing on the prow of the Thirsting Soul, Charlotte Luffy felt a vibration in his teeth that he had never known, a frequency of power that made the sentient waves beneath his ship stop their singing and sink into a terrified silence. This was not the overwhelming gluttonous haki of his mother, nor the cold, calculated foresight of Katakuri. This was something that felt like the sun itself had descended to the sea to demand an accounting. Luffy's rubber skin tightened, his pulse hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Behind him stood a contingent of chess soldiers and his sister Smoothie. Her eyes narrowed in a rare display of genuine concern, but Luffy did not look at her. His gaze was locked on the man standing on the deck of the opposing ship, a man with hair the color of a guttering fire and a cloak that billowed in a wind that shouldn't have existed. "Step no further, Red Hair." Luffy's voice cracked across the water, amplified by the tension in his throat. "You are trespassing on the Queen's table. There is no invitation for you here." The man Shanks did not reach for the saber at his hip. Instead, he looked at Luffy, really looked at him, and the grief that crossed his face was more devastating than any cannonade. Is that what they told you, Luffy? Shanks's voice was soft, yet it carried over the waves with the weight of an ancient truth. That you belong to a table? That you're a dish to be served? Luffy flinched, as if struck. The name, Luffy, sounded different in this man's mouth. When Big Mom said it, it sounded like an acquisition. When this stranger said it, it sounded like a prayer. I am a prince of the Charlotte family, Luffy snarled, his arm coiling into the dark, compressed spiral of a Gomu Gomu no Kong gun, even though he had not yet entered his boiling point. I am the will of the queen. I am the hunger of the islands. You are the son of a man who sought the dawn, Shanks replied, stepping off his ship and walking across the surface of the water, his haki clearing a path through the terrified homies that tried to rise against him. And you are the boy who once told me that a king is the person with the most freedom in the world. Look at your hands, Luffy. Look at the syrup that stains them. Is this the freedom you wanted? The air between them shattered. Luffy launched himself forward, a streak of red and black lightning. His fist, hardened by armament haki and the fury of his indoctrination, collided with the air inches from Shanks's face as the Yonko finally drew his blade. The impact sent a shockwave that tore the frosting from the nearby reefs and sent the thirsting soul reeling. It was a clash of kings, a collision of the D that had been nurtured in darkness and the D that lived in the light. As their haki ground against one another, images began to fracture in Luffy's mind, unauthorized memories that the sweetness of Totto Land had tried to drown. He saw a small bar in a sleepy village. He felt the rough straw of a hat against his brow. He heard the sound of a sea that didn't taste of sugar but of salt and infinite possibility. He saw a man giving up an arm to save a crying child, himself, from the maw of a sea beast. "Stop it!" Luffy screamed, his boiling point erupting, steam hissing from his pores as his skin turned a violent, bruised crimson. "Mama is my mother! The family is my life!" He swung again and again, his rubber limbs lashing out like whips of obsidian. But Shanks did not counterattack. He simply parried, his eyes filled with a shattering compassion. A mother doesn't feed on the ears of her children, Luffy. A family doesn't demand your soul as the price of your name. You are starving, boy, not for food, but for the sky. Shanks moved with a speed that bypassed the rubber boy's enhanced senses. He didn't strike with the edge of his blade, but with the hilt, tapping Luffy directly over the heart, the place where the D lay dormant. The touch was like an electric current. The amber pendant around Luffy's neck, the one containing the stolen soul, shattered into 1,000 jagged shards. The release of energy was cataclysmic. The souls of 100 forgotten victims spiraled upward, a ghostly whirlwind that tore through the artificial peace of the archipelago. Luffy fell to his knees on the deck of his ship, the steam dissipating, his body trembling with a coldness he had never experienced. The sweetness in his mouth had turned to ash. He looked up at Shanks, and for the first time in a decade, the vacant, predatory glaze in his eyes vanished, replaced by a raw, bleeding clarity. They took it, Luffy whispered, his voice trembling. The wind. I can't feel the wind. Then come and find it, Shanks said, extending a hand that was scarred and weathered. But the moment of grace was severed by a roar that shook the very foundation of the sea. From the horizon, the Queen Mama Shanter was approaching, its sentient figurehead screaming in a dissonant, hungry rage. Big Mom had sensed the betrayal. She had sensed the crack in her masterpiece. A massive wave of promethium fire and lightning-streaked clouds began to gather in the sky, casting a shadow that turned the world into a tomb. Luffy looked at Shanks, then at the approaching nightmare of his mother. He realized then that he was not a prince, but a prisoner who had learned to love his cell. The bitter aftertaste of his life rose in his throat, and the rubber boy did something he hadn't done since he was a toddler in a Marine's arms. He reached out. The sky did not simply darken. It bruised, turning the color of a rotting plum as Big Mom descended. She rode atop Zeus, a thundercloud bloated with malevolence, while Prometheus, the sunfire homie, flared behind her like a halo of burning grease. Her laughter was a tectonic grinding of teeth that shattered the crystal glass of the nearby escort ships. "Luffy!" she shrieked, her voice a hurricane of entitlement. "My precious, sweet, disobedient snack! Have you let this one-armed scavenger spoil your appetite? Have you forgotten who gave you a name when the world left you to the tides?" Luffy stood on the shattered deck of the Thirsting Soul, his hand still outstretched toward Shanks, but his eyes were turned upward. The clarity he had found was not a peaceful thing. It was a white-hot iron glowing in the center of his chest. The drums of liberation, a rhythm long suppressed by the heavy rhythmic chanting of Totto Land's soul workers, began to thrum against his ribs. It was a faint, syncopated beat, the sound of a rubber heart finally finding its own pace. "You didn't give me a name, Mama," Luffy said, his voice quiet but carrying through the roar of the storm. "You gave me a leash." The world seemed to hold its breath. Beside him, Charlotte Smoothie drew her blade, her face a mask of horror. "Luffy, stop. Do not speak to her this way. The life debt is absolute." "The only debt I have," Luffy replied, his body beginning to smoke, "is to the boy who died in a forest of candy." He didn't enter his boiling point this time. Instead, he reached deep into the core of his Gomu Gomu no Mi, touching a layer of the fruit's nature that had been forbidden to him. He didn't just want to be hard or fast, he wanted to be unbound. His haki, once a rigid armor of control, began to flow outward like liquid gold, swirling around his limbs in chaotic, joyous patterns. The air began to vibrate with a strange, subsonic hum, a laughter that wasn't his own, but the laughter of 1,000 years of history. "I'm not your prince," Luffy roared, and he leaped. He did not strike at Big Mom with a fist. He struck at the air, his rubbery awakening turning the very atmosphere into a trampoline of redirected force. The shockwave didn't just push the homies back, it changed them. As Luffy's awakened energy rippled through the air, the sentient trees, the singing flowers, and the weeping clouds of Totto Land felt a tremor of something they had forgotten, a heartbeat. The souls that Linlin had stolen and stuffed into inanimate objects began to scream, not in pain, but in recognition. They felt the rhythm of a man who belonged to no one, and for a fleeting second the great soul's grip on her empire wavered. "Traitor!" Big Mom screamed, swinging Napoleon in a massive, flaming arc. "I will tear the years from your bones. I will bake your spirit into a cake of eternal regret." The collision was a cosmic catastrophe. Luffy met the blade not with iron, but with the sheer, defiant flexibility of his soul. He wrapped his arms around the massive sword, his body stretching to impossible lengths, absorbing the impact that would have leveled a mountain. He spun in the air, a whirlwind of red silk and golden haki, and for the first time in history, the sweetest pirate turned the momentum of the matriarch against her. He didn't just fight, he danced. He moved with a manic, rubbery freedom that defied the logic of the Charlotte family's rigid hierarchy. Below on the Red Force, Shanks watched with a grim, proud smile. He knew the cost of this rebellion. Luffy wasn't just fighting a Yonko, he was fighting 10 years of psychological chains. Every punch Luffy threw was a memory shattered. Every dodge was a link in the family contract broken. The battle moved toward the heart of Totto Land, a trail of destruction marking their path. The chocolate rivers overflowed with salt water. The biscuit walls crumbled under the pressure of the warring haki. The siblings, Katakuri, Oven, Daifuku, watched from the shores of Whole Cake Island. Caught in a paralyzing web of loyalty and awe, they saw their little brother becoming something ancient and terrifying. Luffy landed atop the central spire of the Whole Cake Chateau, his breathing heavy, his silk mantle tattered and scorched. He looked down at the city he had helped build, the city of forced smiles and stolen lives. He saw the citizens cowering in the shadows of the gingerbread houses. "The feast is over!" Luffy's voice echoed across the island, sounding like the cracking of a great bell. "From now on, the only thing we're eating is the wind." He raised his fist, and the very ground of the island began to ripple like the surface of a drum. The rebellion of the soul had begun, and the Prince of Hunger was preparing to devour the empire of his mother. The whole cake chateau, once a monument to a mother's gluttony, was now a funeral pyre of melting sugar and screaming history. Beneath a sky torn asunder by the collision of two divergent wills, the very foundation of Totto Land began to liquefy. The scent of caramelized stone and ozone hung heavy in the air, a cloying perfume for the end of an era. At the summit of the crumbling spire, Charlotte Luffy stood no longer as a queen, but as a primordial force of nature. Her hair was a mane of living fire, her eyes two voids of insatiable hunger. Before her stood the boy she had tried to bake into a masterpiece. Luffy, stripped of his plum-colored silk, his chest heaving, his skin glowing with a white-hot radiance that pushed back the encroaching shadows. "You are nothing without the name I gave you." Big Mom's voice was a tectonic plate snapping, a sound that forced the very sea to retreat in terror. "I am the soil. I am the sun. I am the life that flows through your veins. To defy me is to defy the blood that made you." Luffy didn't answer with words. He answered with the rhythm of his heart. The drums of liberation were no longer a faint echo from a forgotten past. They were a thunderous, joyous roar that vibrated through the melting floorboards and into the souls of every living thing in the archipelago. He raised his arms, and the world around him began to turn to rubber, not the stiff, vulcanized rubber of his indoctrination, but a fluid, laughing substance that defied the weight of the world. The stones leaped, the fires bounced, and the very gravity of the chateau seemed to lose its grip on reality. "I don't care about blood," Luffy whispered, though his voice carried like a gale across the new world. "And I don't care about names. I'm just hungry for a horizon that doesn't have a fence around it." He vanished into a blur of light. In this final transcendence, he was no longer the Prince of Hunger or the elastic executioner. He was the sun god of a discarded prophecy, a boy who had walked through the heart of darkness and emerged with a smile that could shatter chains. He moved through Big Mom's soul pocus like a bird through a cloud, his haki not just shielding him, but purifying the air of her suffocating influence. When he struck, he didn't hit her with the weight of his anger. He hit her with the weight of his freedom. His fist, a massive, white-hot piston of pure will, collided with the queen's chest. The impact was not a sound of breaking bone, but the sound of a bell ringing across the centuries. The shockwave rippled outward, touching every homie, every citizen, and every sibling. It was a pulse of absolute clarity, the souls that Linlin had hoarded for decades, the years stolen from the weak, the memories snatched from the brave, were suddenly jolted loose. A kaleidoscope of ghostly lights erupted from the matriarch, a spiraling pillar of life force that ascended toward the heavens, finally escaping the gravity of her greed. Big Mom let out a cry that was half sob, half roar, as the empire she had built on the backs of her children began to dissolve into the sea. The islands of Totto Land, the chocolate, the biscuit, the jam, were reclaimed by the salt of the ocean. The artificial paradise was being scrubbed clean by the very tides it had tried to ignore. As the chateau collapsed into the boiling surf, Luffy found himself suspended in the air for a single, timeless moment. He saw Katakuri standing on a piece of floating driftwood, his scarf gone, his face exposed to the wind, looking up at his brother with a silent, nodding respect. He saw the red force waiting on the edge of the horizon, a silhouette of a future he had almost lost. And he saw the ghost of a straw hat, flickering in his mind's eye like a distant star. He did not reach for the crown of the Pirate King. He did not claim the territory of the fallen queen. Instead, Luffy let himself fall into the water, the very sea that had once been his prison. But as he sank into the blue, he didn't feel the cold or the weight. He felt the salt. He felt the truth. He felt the infinite, unmapped freedom of a man who had finally realized that he was the master of his own hunger. By the time the sun rose, the archipelago of Totto Land was gone. Where once there were towers of cake and rivers of juice, there was only the vast, indifferent blue of the new world. The Charlotte family was scattered, the queen was a memory drowned in the deep, and the world was left to wonder about the boy who had broken the sweetest cage in history. There were no more princes. There were no more puppets. There was only a rubber boy on a small stolen boat sailing toward a dawn that didn't smell like sugar, but like the sharp, stinging promise of 1,000 unknown shores. He had lost his family, his kingdom, and his past, and in the void they left behind, he had finally found himself. The sea is a vast, unyielding archive of grief and glory, and it carries the echoes of a laughter that sounds like the breaking of chains. The boy who was promised the world had refused the gift, choosing instead the struggle of the open sky. And as the waves washed over the crumbs of an empire, the ocean whispered his name, not as a prince or a monster, but as a legend of the man who was too free to be fed. The sea remembered his name, even if the world forgot the boy who almost became a king of candy, only to become a god of the gale.